All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. This is the 7th lecture in our 2016 lecture series on wilderness economics. We have one more lecture next Tuesday. I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, but before I do that, I've kind of been working right along with you guys this semester in learning about economics through each of our speakers, and I don't know if anyone else has had any stories of kind of putting knowledge into action, but last Friday there was a journalist who came to campus, Hal Herring. He lives up on the Rocky Mountain front. Some folks probably know him, or maybe you went to the talk, but he wrote an essay for the High Country News on the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge occupation that occurred earlier this winter. And in the article, which is a great article, I think, out of a lot of writers who talked about that particular public lands issue, he did a really interesting job of framing it in terms of some larger conversations, one being this ongoing discussion about public lands at the federal level and whether we should be selling them to states or private entities, and that's been talked about through multiple speakers this semester. And Hal talked specifically about the economics of that and what would be involved in the transfer of those public lands. What economic benefits there would be compared to the benefits of keeping that in the public interest. So it was interesting, and it was kind of one of those neat opportunities to think in terms of what we've learned about in class here. With something that's actually happening on the ground right now. We will continue to hear about this potential transfer of public lands that has happened and is happening and is proposed at a much greater level across our country. So I would encourage you to use the information you've been learning about in this course, and get into some of those articles and some of that information that's available, and write letters to the editor and opinion pieces, because as always, voices do matter in these topics. So with that, I'll go on to discuss tonight's speaker. Dr. Kimiko Barrett is coming to us from Bozeman, Montana, where she's a native. She did her master's degree in geography at Montana State University in the Department of Earth Science. Her master's thesis actually focused on settlement patterns and reconstructing land use history in Montana's Crazy Mountains, which is a really neat island range of mountains just east of Bozeman, Montana. Some of you may have been there, but it's a pretty neat place. It's been the discussion topic for several different studies of public access, because there's some restrictions in parts of the Crazy Mountains to public access, but beautiful, beautiful mountain range. She did her doctorate here at the University of Montana, so she's had both bobcat and grizzly experience. And she did her doctorate work in the College of Forestry and Conservation, working in India's northern regions of Jammu and Kashmir in the western Himalaya. And she was recently, in 2015, after completing her PhD at the University of Montana, hired by an organization called Headwaters Economics, which she'll be able to talk about more, but it's an economics research think tank based in Bozeman. And they were actually the first organization that I went to when I started putting this lecture series together. There's some amazing publications that they've come out with discussing the role of economics and how it plays out with public lands and rural economies in the West. So I would encourage you to take a look at their website and some of their resources available, and Kimmy will probably show us some of those as well. And of course, like most folks in Montana, she's an avid outdoor enthusiast when she's not doing intensive economic research. So what's neat about tonight's lecture is that I feel like multiple speakers have talked kind of through a wide angle lens on economics, environmental economics with land use, the idea of economics in wilderness or more generally public lands. And tonight, Dr. Barrett's going to focus more on economics and its role in local economies. And she was just talking to me before the lecture, particularly at the county level. So we'll get to look kind of how a lot of these ideas we've been talking about over the last 6 weeks really shape up when we start to look at local rural economies in the West. So with that, I would like to welcome Dr. Barrett to our lecture series.
Great. Thank you, Natalie. Oh, I guess I gotta turn myself on here. Okay, I'm on. Thank you so much, Natalie, for that introduction. It's really great to be back here. Traditionally, I've been like you. I've been a member of the audience, and I've been coming to this lecture series for years. So to come back as an actual invited speaker is really an honor, and I appreciate this opportunity to be here. As Natalie said, I did get my master's through MSU working in the rural geography department, working with a guy named William Wyckoff, who actually specializes in the American West. And then through his amazing mentorship, I went on for a PhD here at the College of Forestry and Conservation and got finished with that in December 2014. And then, as Natalie said, I got hired shortly after by Headwaters Economics. So it just goes to show it can actually happen. You can finish at one point and get a job out of it. So I do work with this group called Headwaters Economics. We are a think tank based in Bozeman. The topic I'm going to be talking about this evening is looking at wilderness and economics, but specifically focusing on the role of federal public lands and what that implies for shifts and changes within the local economy. I'm keeping this presentation relatively short, about 30 to 40 minutes, and at the end I am going to go into our website just a little bit to show some kind of the interactive tools we have available at the Headwaters Economics website. For you as students, they might be useful, and then for just kind of broader knowledge purposes, you might benefit from them. I tend to talk a little bit fast, so if you find that I'm going through this narrative too quickly, literally just kind of do a heads up on me, or if you want me to hesitate on a slide, I have no problem doing that at all. Just kind of flag me down. So the way I'm going to approach this talk this evening is to give you guys first some background context and historical narrative on actually how it came to be that we have so much federal lands in the public or in the West right now. What was some of the historical pieces of legislation that was enacted to allow that? What that meant for kind of the shifting socioeconomic landscape over the 19th and into the 20th century. What that has been like predominantly since the 1970s through modern day 2014. That's a significant era when you start to look at actual local economic shifts, particularly when we start to lean away from a reliance on natural resources and extractive industries, and increasingly start to incorporate more of these quote-unquote new West amenity landscapes. So those that are predominantly driven by recreational pursuits, scenic values, and kind of a broader reevaluation of what natural resources mean for us as a society. And then look at kind of the role of public lands within the West today, and then what this might suggest for future directions. As I said, I work with this group called Headwaters Economics. It's based in Bozeman, and coming from Bozeman, being born and raised there, it's kind of a blessing and a burden. You're given that unique opportunity and perspective to see and grow very intimate and close with a lot of these places and communities that you love so much, and at the same time, you've seen how much they've changed over the course of just 10 to 20 decades, 30, 40 plus. And so, again, it kind of puts you in that unique but challenging position of having to critically assess how some of these changes have really started to affect some of these places that you love so dearly. Headwaters Economics is a policy research think tank. We're a relatively small group. There's only about 10 of us, 8 of which are explicit researchers, including myself. So we look at everything from trail and recreational impacts to energy and coal development uses. More recently, we've been working with communities and wildfire mitigation strategies. And throughout it all, we always kind of focus on those predominant socioeconomic trends and profiles that characterize many of these challenges. And over the past 10 years or so, Headwaters has really focused on really big challenges and complexities, some of those wicked issues that face the American West. And by referencing the American West, what I'm talking about are the 11 western contiguous states situated west of the 100th meridian. And this is common with most scholars that focus in on this region. And what defines this area as kind of such a unique geographic region within the larger continental U.S. Are a number of physical attributes, really. Everything from the fact that it is a highly mountainous landscape, it's really rich in natural resources, it's kind of a vast reservoir for water, there is rangelands and prairie lands, abundant wildlife, and all of these attributes really served as early catalysts for the federal government to acquire and consolidate these lands within federal administrative rule early on. Not so much for explicit purposes of conservation as for initially really extractive and resource utilization. And over time that has transitioned to more of a protected value, but that was not always the case. When you actually look at the percentage of federal land ownership within the West, it's almost half of the entire western, again, those 11 western states falls within federal land ownership. And this is as high as 81% in the state of Nevada and as minimal as 29% for the states of Montana and Washington, which is still about 5 times higher than what it is for the rest of the United States, which averages around 4%. So it's pretty significant. Again, really facilitated through some of those early drivers of natural resource extraction and production as being catalysts for wanting to consolidate some of those landscapes into federal land base. Bringing it back out again to the 11 western states and then focusing more explicitly on Montana, I want to talk a little bit about how it came to be and how, again, this historical backdrop and drawing a lot of this knowledge from my master's degree, bring it and focus on kind of the historical geography and evolution of some of the land base within not only Montana but throughout the American West. And to do that, I'm going to work or focus in on this area called the Shields Valley. And this is an area that I have lived in for the past 8 years. It is where my master's work was done. I don't know if this has a highlighter. Yeah, so right here, this is the Crazy Mountain region that Natalie referenced earlier. It's the 4th highest mountain range in the state of Montana, and the foothills of it is referenced as the Shields Valley. It's about 32 miles east of the town of Bozeman and just north of Livingston. And I want to pick on it and profile it as a case study because a lot of the changes that have taken place within the Shields Valley are indicative of the broader socio, cultural, and economic changes that we've seen taking place across the country, or specifically within the West. But it's really an analogous case setting to see some of this economic transitions taking place. So focusing in on here and kind of providing, again, this historical narrative to it. We've all seen this picture before. It's kind of the emblematic manifest destiny. Really, this was initiated, this era of homesteading and settlement of the American West kicked off in the late 1800s. Henry Frederick Jackson Turner, he's a historian, and in 1863 he released a pretty seminal article called the Frontier Thesis. And out of that he was proclaiming that the American white population was primed to go and settle the West more so than any other culture or civilization prior to that. That we really had the resources, the capital, the drive, the momentum, and the political support to go colonize and resettle this frontier landscape in a way that had never been done before. Shortly after his thesis came out in 1864, Abraham Lincoln signed some significant pieces of historical legislation that really facilitated the first homesteading era. Particularly with respect to Montana, it was the railroad land grants, and that was passed again in 1864. And what that did was grant the railway the right-of-way track, and in addition to that, they got 40 to 50, 60 miles both north and south of that right-of-way track in alternate square sections of land. And the idea behind this was that the railway over time was able to take those private lands and turn them to other private entities, so corporations, companies, homesteaders, and acquire the funds and the capital needed to construct the railway going west. And so this left this legacy of land ownership and really the administrative bane of most land agencies' problems to this day of this alternating checkerboard pattern of private versus public land ownership, something that exists throughout many mountainous regions up until today. In the crazies, most of these private lands were sold off by the 1920s and early 1930s. Here in Missoula, many of those private lands were later sold to Plum Creek Timber. So in addition to the railway legislation, there was the Homesteading Act, there was the Desert Land Act, the Timber and Stone Act, and in 1891 there was the Timber Reserve Act. And that was significant in that it was the federal government recognizing the importance of forested landscapes. Again, not so much for their scenic and recreational appeal as it was for the purposes of mining and timber. And so they early on acquired those lands and claimed them as federal lands and prevented homesteading within those properties. And eventually those lands were turned over to the Forest Service when it was established in 1905. So what you have in this era with the homesteading period is a lot of industries based on natural resources for production. So you've got a lot of the mining, a lot of the timber and logging operations. You have a lot of the early livestock operations coming in. And at first, this was mostly sheep. Sheep steadily became replaced with cattle, but that doesn't happen until the 1920s. And so sheep were really the predominant livestock that characterized most of the rangelands and pasture lands up until a little bit later in the century. Also, you have the creation of some of the first public spaces and public parks, such as Yellowstone National Park in 1872. And then, as I said, in 1905, you've got the establishment of the U.S. Forest Service, which acquired all of those so-called timber reserves that were created in 1891 and turned them into the first national forests. Jumping forward a few decades here into the 1920s and 1940s, the homesteading era in Montana peaked in 1917. And thereafter, it's actually kind of just holds steady up until the latter half of the century. During this early era, wool prices start to steadily drop off, and increasingly sheep are replaced by cattle. In addition, at this time, you have fairly intensive, heavy overgrazing and use of the rangelands and pasture lands. This leads to the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934. This is really the government's first imposition in the western rangelands and their assertion over how western lands and resources were going to be utilized. Highly controversial and led to the Sagebrush Rebellion, in fact. In addition, of course, as we all know, you have the Great Depression taking place at this time. Roosevelt passes a number of legislative acts intended to sustain and promote economic development in rural areas. Everything from the Agricultural Adjustment Act passed in 1933 to the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1933 as well, the Farm Credit Act, and then eventually the Rural Electrification Act, all intended again to at least stimulate, if not sustain, rural economies throughout the West. In the country really, but focused on where areas were either losing or maintaining populations. And so for many rural communities in the West, they either remain stagnant or end up decentralizing as people end up moving to more urbanized areas. Jumping forward to one more decade ahead, or into the 1950s rather, the post-war era, it's an entire shift in terms of where we stood as a country socio and economically. We were victorious from the war. We have, for the first time, Americans in general have a disposable income in a way that they've never had previously. In 1952, the Federal Highway Act was passed, which really established the infrastructure and the transportation network that connected some of these manufacturing centers in the West with the sources of demand and consumerism that were based in the East. So this was really fundamental in connecting the overall country. People, for the first time, are able to incorporate leisure into their daily activities and their lifestyle preference. The American West is kind of reopened and revitalized, highly hyperbolized and mythologized with respect to those nostalgic feelings of what the American West was. That frontier landscape, that kind of cowboy culture comes back to life, really encapsulated quite well with these dude ranches in terms of ranchers finally realizing that they could make money off of people doing their job for them. In addition, people start to visit the first national parks. In terms of the actual number increase, it's quite significant through the 50s. Again, people have the mobility, they have technology that they can utilize, and they do have an income for the first time that they can spend on vacations. So you see increased numbers in parks like Glacier, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, certainly Yellowstone National Park. So again, this is this era of prosperity that takes place during the post-war period. Jumping ahead again into the 1960s, significant, you all in this room I'm sure know, it's the first revitalization of the environmental movement through the country. 1960, Rachel Carson releases Silent Spring, a pivotal piece of work that starts to recognize the intimate connections that human and anthropogenic influences have with respect to ecological processes. In the wake of that publication, a suite of environmental pieces of legislation are passed, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act in '63, the Wilderness Act of '64. NEPA gets passed in '69, Earth Day is celebrated in 1970, later the Endangered Species Act of '73. This is just a snapshot of really the host of environmental acts that were passed during this era. So people are starting to really, it's becoming part of the psyche of kind of the American institution in terms of how we're starting to view natural resources and environmental landscapes in general and as a whole. Jumping forward to the next decade, 1970s, what does this mean for actual areas in Montana and throughout the West? Well, for the first time, people are starting to really utilize these landscapes for non-productive purposes, incorporating their leisure and their vocation hobbies with the ability to travel and see and visit some of these places with an income that they've really never had to that point. So you're seeing activities and recreational pursuits such as camping, skiing, fishing, hiking, visiting parks. Again, really picking up in the 70s, more so than they had any time before then. Jumping forward to the 1990s and 2000s, this trajectory of wanting to live in amenity-oriented landscapes that really stimulate and are facilitated by natural resources for their non-extractive uses, more focused on, again, the recreational and the scenic appeal of them, is really promoted during the 1990s and into the 2000s. So you see large traditional working ranches start to turn over, become more of these amenity hobby ranches. You see folks being able to move here, taking advantage of telecommunications to negate physical workplace for convenience and leisurely avenues. And you see popular culture and mass media to really start to market landscapes of the American West for their non-extractive purpose. And I'll repeat it again, focus in on their recreational and amenity-oriented appeal. I threw this image up here of Marlboro country, just for reference. In the Crazy Mountains in 1990s, Philip Morris came in and bought 5, actually I think it was more, 6 working traditional ranches, each of those about 3,000 to 5,000 acres, and consolidated them into one massive estate that now expands over 20,000 acres, and it's called the Crazy Mountain Ranch, but it is owned by Philip Morris. And in a sense, they've really manufactured Marlboro country as they have kind of nostalgically envisioned it. So they've recreated an entire mining town on this land. It's got a salon, a jailhouse. It's all made with boardwalk, and it's really it's a pretty trippy place actually. But again, it shows how strong that appeal and that nostalgic feeling is for this frontier landscape that we've all kind of grown up with. And if you've got the capital and the resource behind you, you can actually recreate it and manufacture it into this kind of fabricated simulacra of what you actually envision the Western landscape to be like. So the Marlboro Ranch still exists there in the Crazy Mountains. Again, it's in the southwest portion of the area, which speaks to what Natalie was saying with respect to public access. It's because Philip Morris owns 2 of the 3 access points. Also, river runs through it, alternatively known here in Montana as A River Ruined It, released in the 1990s. In addition, Time magazine releases the Western states as part of their front cover claiming that people are moving here for the backcountry values and certainties, yearning for a simpler, rooted front porch way of life. So again, trying to merge the amenities that an urban landscape provides, but bring that with these kind of old school values that the American West is marketed as having. So kind of jumping forward to what does this all mean for the local economy? How have these socio-cultural perceptions and kind of the American psyche influenced how local economies have changed over time? And what I'm really going to do is focus in on this latter era of 1970 through 2014, simply because that's really when you start to see this overall shift away from more of these extractive industries towards this new West amenity-oriented economy. And so when you start to compare the 11 Western states with the rest of the country, there's some pretty significant correlations with respect to how quickly the West continues to really outpace the rest of the country with respect to economic drivers. So population trends in general, the 11 Western states have increased 115% in population since the 1970s. Employment has grown 176%. And overall, real personal income has increased 255%. Looking more closely, explicitly in Missoula County, for instance, Missoula County's population has increased almost 93% over the past 4 decades. Montana, alternatively, has been a bit more moderate, around 46.8%, and the rest of the country is growing at around 56.5%. Looking at this a bit closer, employment has grown in Missoula County over 200% in the past 4 decades. Montana is holding at around 113%, and then the rest of the country is at 100%. So Missoula County itself is outpacing the rest of the country at almost twice the rate when you're looking at some of these predominant economic drivers. Same can be said when you're looking at personal income. Missoula County's grown up to 236% since 1970. Montana has been at 154%, and the rest of the country is at 178%. And then breaking this down lastly to look at actually what is driving the population change in the county. The way we break it down at Headwaters is to look at natural changes in population. So this is actually natural deaths and birth cycles in contrast to net migration. So people moving here intentionally from out of the country or out of the state, or out of the county rather, or out of the state. So looking at Missoula County, almost 63 or over 63% of it is driven by net migration, meaning people intentionally moving into the county from either outside the county or outside the state. Alternatively, for Montana, it's a bit more moderate at 60%. And then when you look at the rest of the country, 35% of population change has been driven by migration out of the country. And so it's almost the actual alternative. It's the inverse relationship with respect to what Missoula County is experiencing. So more people are moving here intentionally from out of the area. And then breaking down types of income that actually constitute what Missoula County is composed of. We break it down at Headwaters by looking at non-labor income versus labor income. And labor income is what I imagine many of you here in the room are doing. It's actually going to a job, it's getting a paycheck, it's earning a wage, it's earning a salary, it's going day by day to actually make your living. The contrast to that is non-labor income, and this is when you are able to, you're either independently wealthy and you're living off of some sort of investment savings, or you have retirement savings, rental income, dividend income, other sources of savings that allow you to not be considered part of the actual labor working force. And here in Missoula County, 43% of the local economy constitutes this non-labor income. So what does that mean? Well, you've got 43% of the income is from elderly folks who, baby boomers, most likely, who are in the position to actually retire and live off of those savings now. Looking a bit more closely at this and breaking it down a bit further and unpackaging it, and I'm looking here at this far left graph. about what kind of components aggregate to make the overall personal income. Looking at this more closely, as I said, you have 43% of it is coming from non-labor income, and then the rest of it breaks down mostly into government employment, which has kind of slightly increased over the course of time, not too significant, a little bump in the late 1990s. Non-services, and by this I'm meaning industries, and I'll get into a bit more detail about this in just a minute, but non-service industries are predominantly those industries that are historically dependent on natural resources, so the extractive economies, and by that I'm talking about agriculture, timber, mining, some construction and manufacturing, and some of the transportation and warehousing sectors. But the biggest rise by far is in the services. And services at large, it's a very broad category, but we're referencing services as being those positions that very often require anywhere from a 2 to 4 year college degree. It's very often within the professional sector. It's these quote unquote office jobs. It's academics, it's university, it's finance, it's real estate, it's recreational or tourism industries. And they have, on average, increased by over 240% since 1970 here in Missoula County alone. Looking closer, or wider really, for the 11 western states and looking at some of their trends, the same can be true. This is a very parallel theme in that the service-related jobs as a whole have increased in this graph since 2001, but these are really similar trajectories that have taken place since 1970. So you have the service-related positions, again, everything from real estate and the professional sector, food services, and finance and trade, to the non-services jobs that continue to wane over time, everything from looking at agricultural and forestry services down to construction and some manufacturing. As a whole, the West in general has increased in the service sectors 92% over the course of 2001 through 2014. Looking at this again, just breaking it down, and I don't want to be too repetitive here, but this is just a pie chart that demonstrates how much of the local economy throughout the West is really involved within the service sector. So you have everything from the professional and the retail trade and healthcare to more of the administrative roles. Again, these quote unquote office positions. Around here, you've got about a sixth of the pie is within government, so largely agency positions. And then this last sixth of the pie is non-service related industries. So everything from agriculture and farm to construction, timber, mining, wood products, paper mills. Again, a lot of the jobs that have historically been very reliant on natural resources for extraction and production. So what characterizes the service sector? In other words, what is it that defines the service sector from non-service sector? And the way Lester Thoreau stated it in 1992, really these are the sectors that require significant amounts of brain power. As I said earlier, at a minimum, there are 2 to 4 year college degree positions. They're in the high-tech world very often, working with telecommunications and tools, new material industries. And they're, in addition, working with footloose economies in that people are able to increasingly negate and negotiate where they're working in contrast to where they want to live and actually leisurely and play and spend time. So this is increasingly defining what kind of industries are available and defining what kind of economy we're living in. This is just a simple infographic Headwaters generated, again hitting on this theme that service-related jobs have grown on average over at least this past decade, but more so before then as well. Examples of some of these high-wage service sector positions, everything from looking at kind of the CEOs of big corporate and high-tech industries, looking at information and utility positions, professional scientific arenas, such as many of you in this room, looking in the academic sector, the university, real estate, wholesale trade, all of these positions earning a high wage but being a footloose economic framework in general. Why is it that people want to live here? Well, I certainly don't need to tell you in this room about that, but effectively what it is these quality of life attributes. The fact that people want clean air, they want clean water, they want a safer community, they want less people. They're wanting to really merge their recreational pursuits with workplace. And so how this breaks down, just to kind of attach it to some sort of metric or quantify it, when we looked at some of the correlations taking place with respect to protected federal lands and local economies, we looked at western non-metropolitan counties, and by non-metropolitan, I'm talking about the statistical definition of a county that generally equates to a county that has less than 50,000 people in it. So for those counties that have at least 10,000 acres of federally protected land, the per capita income on average for individuals was around $436 higher for every 10,000 square acres. What this means, in other words, is if you have County A and County B, and topographically they're the exact county, same county, the only difference being that County A has for example, 100,000 more acres than County B of protected federal lands, then per capita income for County A is going to be over $4,300 per year. Alternatively, if County A has 150,000 acres of protected land, County B has none, then County A on average per capita income is going to be around $6,500 more per year. So looking at this chart, breaking it down again, when you're looking at actual counties with significant proportions of protected federal land in the West, there are some predominant correlations that can be drawn. For example, looking at the primary economic drivers, population increase for those counties with some of the most protected lands has increased 122% over the course since the 1970s up until 2014. Employment has grown 263%. Personal income has grown 380% since 1970. And then per capita income has been a bit more moderate at around 97%. But it needs to be noted that this is not homogeneous across the Western landscape. And at Headwaters, we're not implying a causal relationship. We're not saying that by having protected lands, you're guaranteed to stimulate local economies. That's not what we're suggesting. What we're saying is that there is a correlation between protected federal lands and some of these key economic drivers. But having said that, again, it's a very heterogeneous landscape. And many of the people who do live in the West, 90% almost, are living only within 6 urban areas, whereas the rest of the country, 75% of the population lives within urban areas. So it is higher in the West. Particularly, they are focused within the central areas of commerce and the hubs of economic stimulation, including Seattle, the Bay Area, Los Angeles, Phoenix, Salt Lake City, and Denver. So 75% of all jobs in the West are actually focused within one of these 6 areas of commerce. The same can be true in Montana, where when you're looking at all of the employment base and the workforce within the state, almost 53% of it is concentrated within just 6 counties. Yellowstone County with Billings being the most, and then Missoula follows shortly after at 12%, and then Gallatin County is at third with 11%. So while it might be a very diverse, increasingly diversified economy, it still suggests that many of these positions are concentrated within areas that allow commerce, facilitated through strong infrastructure, usually a university, certainly an airport. And as I'm going to go into here, what influences where some of these jobs are located. And the way we defined it at Headwaters Economics was we broke down all the counties within the West into 3 kind of very broad categories. The first was what we reference as metropolitan counties. So statistically, these are counties that have a population exceeding 50,000 people. They have strong areas of infrastructure. They very frequently have an international airport or a university that they support. They have a very diversified economy. They've been able to pull away from some of their natural resource extractive oriented industries and increasingly embrace some of these more service related positions locations, and they have a lot less volatility overall with respect to their economic growth. Alternatively, you have connected counties. So these are counties that fall very often just under that threshold of a 50,000 population. So they're just, they're almost there, but not quite with respect to being defined categorically as being a metropolitan county. They still have strong sources of infrastructure. Very often they'll still have a university or a campus on site. Frequently they serve as a bedroom community to some of these more metropolitan areas, but they still do have infrastructure and resource to support a sustained economy. And then lastly, you have isolated counties. These are counties that have traditionally been very dependent on historical natural resources for some sort of economic drivers and stimulation of their local communities. They tend to not have any airports or are not connected, at least proximally, to some of these metropolitan areas. And at this point, they are struggling to kind of get in the game. They're trying to figure out how they can either renew themselves or at least sustain themselves going into the upcoming decades. When you look at Montana, Missoula County rather, is actually one of the few counties that is considered a metropolitan county according to our report. What does this imply? That Missoula County, like other metropolitan counties on whole, is going to have less income volatility. It's going to have higher average earnings per job, and that a larger proportion of those jobs is going to be within the service industries. So kind of breaking it down with some key takeaway points here, that while over the course of the 20th century, there has been some fairly significant shifts within social-cultural psyche, kind of the inculcated psyche of how we have interpreted what Western lands and resources have meant to us as a society. This has been reflected in changing market trends, of course, and overall lifestyle preferences. That as a whole, since 1970, counties with the highest share of protected federal lands have performed better with respect to some of those key economic drivers. Again, looking at population, looking at employment trends, personal income, and then per capita income as well. But as I said earlier, this is not homogeneous across the landscape, and that it does not necessarily imply that because you have a high amount of protected public lands that you are going to economically prosper. It's much more nuanced than that. For example, looking at Mineral County, situated just north of us here in Missoula, Mineral County has a substantial amount of protected public lands. Almost 82% of its land base is part of the Forest Service. In contrast to Missoula and Gallatin County at a much more moderate level of 43%. Having said that, however, Mineral County with respect to population trends has only, has only grown 44% since 1970. Missoula, as I said earlier, has exceeded 90%, and Gallatin County is close to 200% population growth. With respect to employment trends, Mineral County employment base has only grown 67%. Missoula has exceeded 200%. And Gallatin County is at 46% growth in the employment base. Looking at sources of income, labor income, so again, those kind of positions that actually require a wage or a salary, has increased 60% in Mineral. In Missoula, it's been 155% growth. And in Bozeman and Gallatin County, it's been 438%. And then lastly, looking at non-labor income, so again, retirement, baby boomers living off dividends or investments. In Mineral County, it's increased 286%. In Missoula County, it's increased 475%. And then in Gallatin County, it has exceeded 760% since 1970. So again, just because you have a lot of protected federal lands does not necessarily mean that you're going to economically prosper if you don't really have the resources or the infrastructure to support that economic growth. So kind of some of the key final takeaways here is that while every county has unique circumstances, their overall message is that the changing economy of the West has impacted all counties and really altered that fundamental role of protected public lands and the importance that they play, again, within popular society and culture today. And that really the gradual assimilation of Old West traditions with New West value systems is going to continue to influence how we protect, conserve, and manage these lands and resources moving forward. With that, I will add my contact information up here. I can also be reached off of our website, off the Headwaters Economics staff page. I'm going to take a quick minute and just kind of show you some of these interactive tools that Headwaters has hosted on our site that as students you might have some value from. One of the big things that we have is this economic profile system with a bunch of variables here that you can generate reports for any county, any municipality, a state, a region. You can type in Missoula County, Mineral County, for example, and then just click download report, and it will throw out an entire 14-page report with all of the census profile and economic data that you would need for any particular scale or unit of analysis that you're working at. Really helpful for kind of a cliff note to any sort of economic report that you might have. Some of the other tools that we have is a data viz where you can look at everything from trail and recreational use, county payments. Again, just kind of breaking down the economic profiles for many of the western states with respect to county level, community, city level, anything like that that you would be interested in. So with that, I can open it up to questions. If anybody's got any comments. All right, I'm done. Barrett, out.